What's up, music lovers? Thanks for clicking on my channel, and welcome to a series that I call Artists That Deserve More Love, where we take a minute to recognize artists, musicians, and composers that just deserve a little bit more attention than they usually get. And these can be bands with careers lasting decades, but they're just in a really niche community, so they don't have a super broad appeal, or they can be musicians with only 20 followers on Spotify. Whatever the case is, you're missing out by not knowing their music. And I guess for this episode, I was feeling a little folkish because pretty much all of the people I'm about to talk about have some connection to folk music. But before we get into that, if you like hard rock, heavy metal, progressive rock, music in general, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, all of that YouTube stuff. I know it's a cliche to ask, but it really does help the channel grow, so thank you in advance for that. With that self-promotion out of the way, let's just get into it and start talking about some musicians. And the first musician I'm going to talk about in this episode is one of my all-time favorite film composers, James Horner. You might not know him by name, but you've certainly heard his music because the sheer number of movies he's worked on is absolutely insane. Everything from Star Trek II to Southpaw to Aliens to A Beautiful Mind to Apocalypto to Braveheart to Field of Dreams and oh yeah, frickin' Titanic. And that's with me leaving out literally dozens of other movies that he worked on. Not only was James Horner super prolific, but the quality of his writing was always top notch as well, which is crazy to think about when you consider just the sheer number of movies he was involved in. His scores to Braveheart, Troy, and Titanic are some of my favorite film scores of all time. Well, they'll always be behind Lord of the Rings because Howard Shore, but they're still incredible. What I really enjoy about James Horner's music is that he was very good at combining modern instruments with Celtic music. He was also really passionate about combining new instruments into his sounds and playing around with synths and different textures. One of his trademarks was also being able to write absolutely soaring melodies that get stuck in your head. He unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and while he's widely respected, especially if you're a film lover, he doesn't really have the same name recognition that someone like John Williams or Hans Zimmer does, and so for that reason I thought he'd be a good choice to include in this series. Any of his soundtracks would be a good place to start if you're trying to get into his music more. For me personally, in addition to Troy, Braveheart, and Titanic, I really love his compositions for A Beautiful Mind, Enemy at the Gates, and Aliens. Okay, and coming up next is Trader Horn, a folk band from the UK that only released one album in 1970, but it's a really good album. The album in question, Morning Way, is such a weird mix of psychedelic, folk, kind of peaceful, but also kind of vaguely threatening. And on vocals, this band has a male and female singer, which is something I always love when you have those two different voices blending together so seamlessly. It really adds a different layer to the music that you can only really have if you have a man and a woman singing in your band. And as weird and out there as this album is at times, it also has a lot of great songs, and the band did a fantastic job of blending what was at the time new instruments with traditional folk instruments. There's of course a lot of acoustic guitar and mandolin, but there's also a lot of synths on the album. And being that they're old synths from the 1960s and 70s, they have this very ethereal, analog, kind of out there sound, which just makes the band sound more unique. So this is kind of the complete opposite of James Horner, where he has dozens of places you could start with. With these guys, Trader Horn, you only have the one album you can check out. Some of my favorite songs on that album are Children of Ore, Growing Man, Three Rings for Elven Kings. You gotta get that Tolkien reference in there. The Mixed Up Kind and In My Loneliness are also really great songs from that album. From beginning to end though, it's just a really cool piece of music, especially if you're looking for something that doesn't really sound like anything else. Okay, and the third and final band I'll be talking about in this episode is Griffin. Griffin was formed in the UK and has released 7 studio albums, with the majority of them being released in the 1970s, with the last couple being released in the last 10 years or so. And Griffin is without a doubt one of the most unique bands I've ever come across. You can describe their music as medieval progressive folk rock. I know, it's like the nerdiest and also the most awesome way of describing music ever, right? Their music is driven mainly by woodwinds and actual Renaissance era instruments, but they do also include a lot of keyboards and synthesizers, and you can tell that they're still heavily influenced by modern jazz fusion and progressive rock. Modern by the definition of the 1970s when they were putting out their albums. Honestly, when you think of Griffin, you could say that these guys invented dungeon synth music, because when you listen to some of their albums, it really does feel like dungeon synth, but from the 1970s. If there was a 1970s prog rock iceberg chart, which probably exists somewhere, these guys would be well below the surface. Like, you think Genesis and King Crimson and Yes are prog? Ha! Poser. This is like down in the Gentle Giant era of prog rock, but honestly they're a little bit more niche than even Gentle Giant. I've liked all the albums I've heard by them, but in my opinion their best album is without a doubt Red Queen to Griffin 3. Look at that album cover. Look at that guy right there. That's what you call winning at life, okay? Whatever winning at life is, this guy is doing it. He's so much more sophisticated and suave than any of us, but you know, you can feel a little bit like that if you go listen to this album right now. On a more serious note, I do think that this is the album where they perfectly blend their Renaissance influence with their modern influences. It really is just a good mix of the two, where it feels very much as though it's progressive rock and jazz fusion, but there's enough instruments in there that are kind of out there for the time that you really do get the sense that this is not quite in that same genre. It's a bit different. Opening Move and Checkmate are probably my two favorite songs from this album, but the entire album just flows so seamlessly. It's really best just to listen to it from beginning to end in one sitting. Their debut album, Griffin, is probably their most medieval sounding album, and they get more and more rock oriented as their career goes on. I also really like the track Midnight Mushrooms. It's a 18.5-minute long epic instrumental track. Out of all the artists in this episode, Griffin is the one I've been listening to the most recently, and I think that has to do with their wide array of both influences and musical instruments. So there you have it. Those are 3 musical artists that, in my opinion, deserve to get a bit more attention. Hopefully you got something out of this video, and if you think this channel deserves more love, please hit the like button, subscribe, comment, all of that YouTube stuff. I also have an instrumental song out right now called Waking Giant. If you want to check that out, there's a link below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at the next video.